The Masters Behind the Thrones Chapter 1. The philanthropist's playbook history, with all its grand clashes and heroic figures, tends to make rather poor reading material. Messy, unpredictable, full of inconvenient things like morality. So much tidier to view it from the penthouse suite, wouldn't you agree? That's where we, the Masters Behind the Throne, excel. We appreciate the long view, the interconnectedness of, well, everything. A peasant uprising here, a strategic resource shortage there, the right nudge, the opportune investment, and the world dances to our tune. Take Sir Reginald Huffington Smythe, a true titan of our age. You may know his work via those heartwarming documentaries about his foundation building wells in quaint little war zones. Such touching footage, children with grateful smiles, suspiciously photogenic rubble. What those cameras don't show are the meetings that preceded that generous donation. The closed doors deal with the local strongman, a charming, if volatile fellow, in which Sir Reginald secured exclusive mining rights for a rather inconveniently placed mountain. A regrettable bit of collateral damage displaces the villagers? Well, that's where the Well project comes in. Splendid PR and a perpetually grateful and cheap labor pool. But Reginald is merely a student of grander masters. Do recall the esteemed Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, founded by that steel magnate fellow. Such a staunch advocate for harmony they were, until whispering the right inducements into the ears of presidents. Suddenly, those charming Latin American nations were in dire need of battleships. Carnegie Steel, naturally, filled that demand quite lucratively. It was a symphony of mutually assured profits, a testament to the true meaning of peacemaking. Of course, modern times necessitate a more subtle touch. The public has a distaste for blatant bloodshed these days. Which is why we've become so fond of that delightful phrase, regime change. One funds an aspiring revolutionary, perhaps a disgruntled academic, a few fiery pamphlets, some conveniently leaked documents, and voila. A formerly stable nation crumbles into delightful chaos, perfect for resource extraction and testing those new drone models, wouldn't you say? The Huffington Smythes of today make their fortunes in reconstruction contracts, naturally. Disaster capitalism, such a poetic term for it. Yet, perhaps our most brilliant invention is the system itself. Those tiresome regulations, the loopholes large enough to sail an aircraft carrier through, did you think those occurred by chance? Every tax haven, every shell corporation, crafted with care by our associates behind those tedious legislative bodies. We're not simply players in the game, you see, we wrote the rulebook. This is where the true artistry lies. The wars may flare and fade, names of despots and martyrs scroll across headlines, but we endure. There will always be devastation in need of rebuilding, hungry armies in need of weapons, and desperate populations in need of saviors, at exorbitant interest rates, of course. We don't simply profit from conflict, we cultivate it. So, as you turn those dusty pages of history books, remember the architects hidden behind the smoke and statistics. We are the ones who truly shape the world, far removed from the consequences our brilliance creates. Philanthropists, investors, visionaries, or perhaps, as some of those less enlightened souls might claim, monsters. But then, isn't that the price of progress? Chapter 2. The Merchants of Uruk when warfare was a growth strategy. Sumer. Land of ziggurats, cuneiform tablets, and the very dawn of profitable bloodshed. Those charming folks may have invented writing and the wheel, but where they truly excelled was trade, and the inevitable squabbles that arise when piles of precious metals are involved. Picture, if you will, the glorious city of Uruk. Less of a city, really, and more of a statement. Gleaming temples, bustling marketplaces, and the smug aura of being the absolute center of the civilized world. All this needed resources, naturally. Grain for the masses, cedarwood for the palaces, and of course, a touch of gold and lapis lazuli to ensure the gods were properly impressed. Trouble was that those vital materials weren't exactly growing in their backyard. This is where the merchants came in. A rather clever lot, less like your dusty caravan traders and more like, well, proto-CEOs. They saw potential where others saw only desert in those pesky rival city-states. Those states, you see, had the annoying habit of controlling the good trade routes. Eridu with its access to the sea, With its stubborn grip on those copper mines, how was Uruk to prosper under such restrictions? The solution was delightfully simple: war. But not the messy, pitched battle kind, far too vulgar for Uruk's elite. Instead, think strategic pressure, advisors sent to stir up trouble among rival factions, and well-timed raids to secure crucial supply lines. Suddenly, those rivals found themselves mysteriously weakened, plagued by internal strife, and curiously eager to negotiate new trade terms, ones heavily favoring Uruk, wouldn't you know? Lugal-Kanish Dudu, king of Uruk, was a man who understood this dynamic well. Or rather, understood that his advisors, those shrewd merchants with their networks and bulging purses, understood it. They'd murmur about threats, lament the barbaric behavior of the neighbors, and then casually suggest that perhaps a modest investment in Uruk's military might be prudent. Lugal-Kanish Dudu may have postured on the palace balcony, but it was the merchants who filled his armory. The profits flowed like the Tigris in springtime. Grain, metals, timber, all conveniently acquired and resold at a tidy markup. Uruk grew fat and complacent, convinced of its divine right to all the best resources. It was, as these things tend to be, a self-fulfilling prophecy. With wealth came more weaponry, more influence, and ever more justifications for a spot of preemptive conquest. And so, the pattern repeated. A trade dispute here, a whispered insult there, and soon another city-state bent the knee. The merchants of Uruk were the invisible puppet masters, their battleground the marketplace, their weapons forged from economic necessity. One might wonder what became of Sumer, with its endless cycle of petty empires fueled by greed. Empires rise and fall, as history loves to remind us. But the legacy of the Uruk model lives on. From boardrooms to back alleys, the strong will always profit from exploiting the weak. Perhaps the tools have become more sophisticated, the justifications more veiled, but the core truth remains. War is a profitable business, and there will always be those eager to turn bloodshed into gold. Chapter 3. Sargon the Great and his mercenary pals the Akkadians, bless their ambitious little hearts, took the whole empire concept and ran with it. Those Sumerian cities-states with their petty squabbles were quaint, but Sargon had grander visions. Visions that required a rather massive army, and the funds to keep them fed, equipped, and most importantly, loyal. See, Sargon wasn't your typical divinely appointed king. A usurper, some called him. An upstart with a knack for violence, others whispered. He lacked the pedigree, but made up for it in sheer audacity. This, as it turns out, makes for a rather unstable power base. Lucky for Sargon, some men are bound not by love of king or country, but by something far more reliable: gold. Enter the military entrepreneurs. A new breed of soldier, less idealistic knight and more profit-minded contractor. These fellows didn't care much about Sumerian gods or Akkadian pride. They cared about loot, land grants, and the thrill of a good conquest. Sargon, ever the pragmatist, recognized their potential. A loyal army is expensive. A mercenary army? Well, they pay themselves, out of the pockets of the conquered, of course. It was a match made in blood-soaked heaven. Sargon got his legions, hardened veterans with a healthy disregard for civilian casualties, great for sieges. The entrepreneurs got their spoils and a generous cut of any new territory their swords acquired. Everyone won, except perhaps the hapless folks being conquered. Leading this merry band were men like Shar and Rimish. Not exactly household names, but the true power brokers of their day. These weren't mere battlefield captains, they were CEOs with chariot divisions. They'd recruit, finance their own regiments, and then present themselves to Sargon with a ready-made invasion force. Think of them as venture capitalists, investing in high-risk military expeditions with the promise of astronomical returns. Naturally, they weren't doing this out of the kindness of their hearts. Each campaign was an itemized transaction. Troops equipped? That'll be so many talents of silver. Strategic advice? An additional fee. Captured city ripe for plunder? Well, the commander and his closest associates naturally deserved first pick. Sargon understood this game well. He kept his entrepreneurs fat and happy, indulging their egos with titles and territories. In return, they kept the empire expanding, the gold flowing, and any potential rivals conveniently dead on a distant battlefield. The Akkadian Empire wasn't built on idealism, but on a rather ingenious profit-sharing scheme. But empires, like poorly structured pyramids, have a tendency to topple. All those ambitious entrepreneurs, flush with wealth and private armies, started getting ideas above their station. When the central authority weakens, as it does when your king spends more time on campaigns than governance, yesterday's loyal contractor becomes today's aspiring warlord. Sargon's descendants spent as much time suppressing rebellions as they did conquering new lands. Turns out, the very system that fueled the empire's rise also sowed the seeds of its chaotic demise. One can't help but admire the irony of it all. The takeaway here, dear reader, is that the business of war is inherently unstable. You empower those with a thirst for violence and a talent for profit, and soon enough, they'll want a bigger slice of the blood-soaked pie. Empires may rise and fall, but the entrepreneur is eternal. Whether in shining armor or a tailored suit, there will always be those who see conflict not as a tragedy, but as an opportunity. Chapter 4. Pyramids, Prophets, and the Manipulation of the Divine Ancient Egypt, land of pharaohs, pyramids, and power dynamics so convoluted they'd make a soap opera writer blush. While the pharaohs got top billing, enjoying their god-king status for all it was worth, it was the folks whispering behind their gilded thrones who truly shaped the course of empires. You see, being an all-powerful, divinely ordained ruler is surprisingly exhausting. All those ceremonies to attend, obelisks to commission, smiting of enemies to oversee, leaves precious little time for the tedious business of actually running a kingdom. Delegation, as any shrewd ruler knows, is key. This is where the advisors slither in, the priests with their cryptic prophecies, the viziers with their overflowing ledgers, and the ever-ambitious generals with their glinting swords. The pharaohs, bless their hearts, were a theatrical bunch. Prone to visions of grandeur, a touch obsessed with the afterlife, and highly susceptible to flattery. An advisor who knew the right words, the carefully staged omen, could nudge their living god towards surprisingly lucrative decisions. Take the esteemed Imhotep, architect, priest, and all-around manipulative genius. Old Imhotep wasn't content with just interpreting the god's whims, he started suggesting them. Enter the Step Pyramid, a grand funerary project that conveniently cemented Pharaoh Djoser's power, and kept the stonemasons busy for decades. Was it necessary? Well, the gods seemed to think so, and who were mortals to argue? Then there's the delightful tale of Hatshepsut, the rare female pharaoh with a knack for self-promotion. Her reign was marked by lavish temples, a wise investment in keeping the priests happy, and surprisingly few wars. Now, was this due to her genuine pacifism, or the fact that her advisors were making a tidy fortune on trade expeditions to Punt? History is frustratingly silent on such matters. But where the system truly shines is in its synergy. Wars, when they did happen, were fantastic for drumming up religious fervor. Those pesky Nubians weren't just a border nuisance, they were an affront to the gods. Smite them, Pharaoh, and Amun shall smile upon you. And of course, the spoils of war had a way of finding themselves donated to conveniently grateful temples. Temple complexes, in turn, weren't mere vanity projects, they were economic powerhouses. Vast landholdings, workshops churning out goods, grain stores that could make or break a famine year. The line between priest and landlord was often blurry, especially when accounts were written in hieroglyphics most peasants couldn't decipher. Piety and profit went hand in hand. This delicate dance of manipulation required a touch of theater. A well-timed festival reminding the populace who was in charge, a few miracles to bolster faith, and the occasional sacrifice to appease a disgruntled god, or silence a troublesome critic. The pharaohs might be the face of power, but they were puppets in a much larger, self-serving show. Alas, all good things, even exploitative systems built on superstition, must come to an end. Empires crumble, dynasties fall, and even the most cunning priests eventually find themselves inconveniently dead. Yet, the core principle remains. Those who control the narrative, who manipulate the divine and the purse strings, often hold more true power than any crowned king. As you wander through echoing temple ruins today, remember, they aren't just monuments to forgotten gods. They are a testament to the timeless art of enriching oneself under the guise of serving something far, far greater.